Thank you very much, Arno. Thanks for the organizers. As was mentioned, we are on the analytical part in this game, so I'm not going to give any very concrete comments on the proposed papers, except that it's going to be very complicated, and many of us, including myself, don't know what we're talking about. I've been carrying out cost-benefit analysis in the transportation sector, being an infrastructure economist, and so I can only support what you have said from the Parliament and from the CER side. It's a useful instrument, but it should not be over-evaluated. And you'll see an application that I brought, which has just been published, I think, two weeks ago, which is called Planning the Offshore North and Baltic Sea Grid. In case you can't read what stands here, we've carried out probably the first technical socioeconomic analysis of the North and Baltic Sea Grid coming from Berlin. I insist on the fact that there is a Baltic Sea too that should help to attain the renewable targets. And I'll tell you a little bit about this. The study is available on the web. And I've put together 6 points for the discussion. First of all, of course, transmission is very important in the context of the energy roadmap, which interestingly, all the scenarios, if you look at them, they arrive at least 2/3 of renewables. I'm not quite certain how Pantelis is going to fill out the remaining third, but they more or less converge. So transmission is important, but it's not the big issue. What's the big issue? Biggest issue is generation. By this, I don't mean that transmission is not a difficult issue, but if you look at the investment figures for cross-border infrastructures, they are large. They kind of diverge between the infrastructure package says 140, here it says 100. You can argue about the figures, but it's, if I may say so, it's peanuts with respect to the generation investments that are required. And I put up here the figures by the European Climate Foundation. You can put up the figures by Pantelis, anyone else. And these are distributed between CapEx and OpEx. And they are in the range of about a factor of 10 of the transmission expenditures. And beyond the 2020 targets, we don't really have a clue how they are going to be invested beyond 2020, and that's not only on renewables, it's also on conventional. This relates to the issue of capacity instruments, etc. So I think we have a even more complicated challenge here in generation than we have in transmission. Let me come to transmission now. This is a quotation by my friend Ignacio Perez Arriaga, with whom I work intensively, and who says, transmission, since it's such a crucial thing, should be as unexciting and boring as possible. Don't venture yourself into experiments on transmission, probably the way we've ventured into financial markets, because it's not worth the while. He says, and this is from an MIT discussion paper, sophistication and complexity in transmission planning, leaving it to the market, for instance, only causes indecision in investors, higher capital costs, most frequently lack of investment. I think this is true. I used to think we should deal with this in much more of a capitalist market style. I don't think this anymore because I've now 15 years of experience. I think regulated investment will remain the main part, and that does not include new players coming into the market. But I mean, how are you going to finance offshore high-risk investments unless they are regulated? You're not going to find investors or just at very high capital costs. And if you want to introduce incentives, you should do OpEx benchmarking and abandon TOTEX benchmarking, which is, for example, still the case in Germany. And then it's always better to build more lines. And I'm not a vendor here for any cable company. It's always better to build a kilometer too much than too little. So I think we have, as was mentioned, we have good experience. Could be better, but I don't foresee a very dramatic change in the way infrastructure is financed and regulated. Now, you've seen this slide, I think, twice today. I borrowed it from Jean-Arnaud Vinois. And for my taste, the current regulation on the table is probably more important for infrastructure planning than it's for financing. If you read the Ronald Berger study that was mentioned also already today, any TSO who has a investments rating will be able to raise financing. There's a discussion about what the rate of return is. Is it 4, 3, 6, 12, whatever? But that's not really an issue so far. The issue is really trans-border planning, and in that respect, I think the current paper makes a big advantage, makes a big step, because that's a new approach that has been chosen, and I think the social benefits come much more from the planning side than they come from the financing side, given that the financial instruments in the PCI and the Connecting Europe facility are relatively modest, right? So they are important, but they are more important in steering the investment rather than to create financing themselves. Now let me come to our study, and there are several studies around. CEPS has just published one, I know one of CEFEP and et cetera. I think the uniqueness of this one is that it has attempted, beyond the realized grid where we were also involved in, has attempted a quantification of the benefits. Costs are relatively easy. You just ask people from Europe Cable how much does it cost. You add a factor of 10 for transaction costs and of implementation, and then you have the costs. How about the benefits? What we have tried to do here with a quite detailed model covering the entire Northern Europe zone with several scenarios is to run 2 different scenarios. One is the so-called trade scenario, which kind of connects directly Norway, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and don't forget the Baltic Sea, Kriegers Flak, Baltic Cable, etc. And oppose this to a mesh scenario, which is kind of dream of, amongst others, the offshore grid studies. And by the way, something Konstantin Schachels and myself discussed 7 years ago at a reception at the Drewag Stiftungslehrstuhl. And at the time, I didn't know that things would maybe come about. But so let's think about these 2 scenarios and look at the benefits. And there are assumptions, of course, on generation park in the wind scenario. This is about 10 months of work, and it gives you the benefits in terms of benefits split up on the producer benefits, that is what producers can gain, which is the consumer benefits, this green, these green bars here, producer surplus is blue, the congestion rents, both internal and cross-country, and the sum of this gives the welfare change. Now, it's often stated that the North Sea grid has positive or has a benefit cost analysis beyond 1, which is more likely. But if you look at the bar in terms of the welfare changes distributed quite unevenly between the participating countries in the first place, and second, as Harberger said, the old economist, rectangles are larger than triangles. So if you think of it in terms of welfare changes, the changes for the individuals, be it producers or consumers, are much more large than the overall benefit. So unless you take into account these distributional issues at the outset, any methodology will lead you into endless political debates. And that's why I think in the cost-benefit analysis, there needs to be taken into account the distributional aspects. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to apply them. Now, the North Sea grid, as you've seen, is very easy. In particular, the trade scenario is a very easy connection, plus it's technically not very much mesh. imagine you wanted to do this in a meshed system, let's say transporting electricity from, I don't know, from Austria to Nice to Italy, then you would have a much more complex situation still. So I propose this as an exercise in benefit analysis, not having identified costs in detail here, but I would support the statements that this can only be a useful tool, but should not guide too much into the decision process. If you aggregate this, so if you take the welfare change, either positive red or positive green or red negative, then this comes out. Now, suppose that you have this distribution of benefits, the green countries, and losses, the red countries, and this is relatively similar in the trade and the mesh scenario. You see here the effects are much stronger in the mesh scenarios because that's where the effects play more dramatically. Then you have winners and losers. Now, if you know this at the outset, you better take into account measures to compensate, because otherwise important players, and in this case it's high-cost producers, France, Germany, that lose, whereas relatively low-cost producers win. And inversely, French and the German consumers win, and the Norwegians and UK consumers lose because they're going to have to pay more. If you don't take this into account at the outset, you'll have a problem. To finish this, oh no, sorry, this is important too, because this is an analysis of the congestion rents available on individual lines. And this is not an investment analysis, but it takes congestion rents and looks how are these congestion rents distributed in the status quo, in the trade scenario, and in the mesh scenarios. And this is for each of the lines. And since I'm not an investor, I don't run the risk of being partial here. But there's, except probably for the Nordnet 2 and one or two, probably the Skagerrak cable, there's not many cables that can pay by themselves on congestion rents only, which means that merchant is an option in some cases, but in very little cases, in particular if you take into account the risk that merchants run by other lines being constructed. Okay, here's the last food for thought that I want to propose here, and this comes from discussions with TSOs. I think we should not underestimate the facility of bilateral transmission investments, and this is the German-Norwegian case here, and this is a citation from Statkraft, who's preferring probably to do bilateral communications rather than multilateral. Why? If you think about this in terms of transaction costs, here are the number of contracts that you need to negotiate as a function of the number of participants in a project. Now, if you have two, pick Norway and Germany here, you can take the UK and the Netherlands, whatever. You have one contract. If you have 5 participants around the North Sea, you already have 10. If you take the North Sea Offshore Grid Initiative, you have 8 participants, so you get 28 contracts. And if everybody, including the potential veto parties in the council, for example, you get 300. Now, this is of course not saying we should not have a European coordination. I'm saying my stomach tells me that at least for the next period, we'll have more bilateral transmission deals than multilateral ones. And I'm looking forward to further development in this field. Thanks a lot for your attention.